when emotional brain is engaged, our executive functioning suffers. So prefrontal cortex, that is in charge of problem solving, logic, doesn't really get much airtime because we are in panic mode. So our amygdala is saying there is a threat and you need to do something about this threat. So, and that if we are in that state, well, firstly, it really is negatively impacting our physical health and our mental health. Fight, flight, and freeze is healthy for short periods of time, and if there is an actual danger. But in our complex modern or postmodern life, perceiving danger ongoingly means a chronic stress response, and it also means inflammation in the body, and it really can negatively impact, again, physical health. And then when it comes to our decision making, problem solving, we're not operating at our full capacity.
Okay, cool. So I guess a good place to start is, how is peak performance applicable to everyday life?
We perform pretty much with anything we do every day, and it really largely impacts on our personal growth and us being able to achieve a full potential in our life. And I'll explain that a little bit. So, well, performance is defined, first of all, as carrying out or accomplishing a task or action or function. And peak performance is doing so at the highest level of ability, efficiency, or effectiveness. So whether it's decision making, so making better decisions, whether it's improved well-being and self-care, whether it's increased productivity, or achieving goals, boosting confidence, performing at peak serves us well in any of those areas. Yeah, very much so. We typically, traditionally, when we spoke about peak performance, we were talking about athletes. These days, we talk about peak performance when it comes to executives and performance in organizations. But adopting the principles of peak performance in everyday life can make our lives be much more productive and enjoyable. So, yeah.
And so when it comes to peak performance, if there was, say, categories or a way of seeing it that might be a little bit easier to understand. So, like you said there, a lot of people see performance as something to do with sport or something to do with, maybe public speaking is another example as well. So is there a way to think about this in the context of the everyday person? And feel free to use an example like, small business owners, or it could be anything like that. But is there a way of thinking about it that goes into phases or categories?
Sure. So let's say if you use that example of small business owner functioning at his or her best. So to perform at peak or to function at our best, well, we firstly need to be skilled. So they would have to be pretty comfortable with the tasks that they're performing every day, and the tasks would still have to be somewhat challenging, but not too challenging. So the job would be quite stimulating. And they would have to be pretty good at maintaining focus and concentration, and ideally staying in a state of flow. So we hear a lot about state of flow, and we know that it is highly connected to well-being. If a small business owner can go about their day performing the tasks that they need to perform in a state of flow, that would also mean well-being. It would mean higher productivity. So it would free up some time for self-care, for well-being, for nurturing relationships. And we know that that's an important factor in well-being and longevity. And their relationships would be better quality because they're more likely to be mindful in how they're interacting with others. So overall, their productivity at work, how they perform in their job, as well as their personal life, would be better off if in that state of performing the tasks in a state of peak performance or flow. I mean, a lot of the times we run an autopilot, and say a small business owner does typically a job or several roles in their job. There would be a person that strategizes, but there would also be a person that puts out fires and that has to worry about everyday routine tasks. And sometimes it's very easy to lose perspective and to be strategic in their position because they get caught in being reactive to whatever their environment or whatever is going on around them. Some emotions can come into play, such as anxiety around meeting the KPIs or being able to cover the overheads, etc. So, a lot of the times I work with lots of executives, work with some business owners. It's easy to lose a sight of what's actually really important and feel like they're never getting on top of everything they need to do. So some of the business owners I work with would say, well, I work into really late hours at night. I still feel like I haven't finished everything. And then my work tends to run into a weekend. And that obviously can cause all sorts of issues for that person, again, in terms of sacrificing their own personal well-being and losing that balance between work and personal life. So it can be very helpful to learn how to get into peak performance state and get things done in a more productive and optimal way, more efficiently.
Yeah, and I think so much of, and for any business owners listening out there, myself included, and also you, I think it's so easy to fall into that reactive, stress state where everything's happening to you, not for you. And because everything's being thrown at you all the time, it's so easy to fall into reactivity, right? Into what I would call survival mode. How much of how much of survival mode is impacting how we perform?
It's greatly impacting how we perform because when we are in survival mode, we're in fight, flight, and freeze response. So our emotional brain is engaged, and we know that when emotional brain is engaged, our executive functioning suffers. So prefrontal cortex, that is in charge of problem solving, logic, doesn't really get much airtime because we are in panic mode. So our amygdala is saying there is a threat and you need to do something about this threat. So, and that if we are in that state, well, firstly, it really is negatively impacting our physical health and our mental health. Fight, flight, and freeze is healthy for short periods of time, and if there is an actual danger. But in our complex modern or postmodern life, perceiving danger ongoingly means a chronic stress response, and it also means inflammation in the body, and it really can negatively impact, again, physical health. And then when it comes to our decision making, problem solving, we're not operating at our full capacity. Our perspective is generally skewed. It's very difficult to take a broader perspective. I feel it's really important to check in with ourselves and ensure that we don't prolongingly stay in this survival mode. And because in a long term, really, it will result in negative consequences for ourselves, but also for our businesses.
Yeah, when you're in that state, it's hard to take advice like take more time to, learn your values or to learn about what routines or what things you need to have in place. So I guess a case for those things and just laying it out in a easy to understand way. what are some of the things that people need to look at? So you mentioned you have the skills there. There has to be some level of flow and also concentration there as well. So I imagine there's many elements to this. I'm just going to throw a few out there and just tell me if I'm right. The first thing might be,
Yes.
or one of the things might be having your values listed out, which I did a few days ago. I've been having these things percolating in my mind. I listed them out and I review them in the last couple of days I have because they've been on my mind. But it'd be have values would be the first one or the one of them. Number two would to be create an environment that's conducive to concentration. So, away from distractions. Maybe your office space is where you don't keep a phone in the room, which might be hard for business, but certain periods you don't keep your phone there. And maybe number three is, well, I'll let you fill that one in if I'm right so far. But those are my two ones. How are they so far, and what are some ones we can add to that?
I think that's a great start to the list. I really like how
Mm.
you started with values. Values are like lighthouses, really. A lot of the times we have to make tough decisions. If we are aware of our values and hierarchy of our values, it's much easier to do so. I would also add to that meaning, so connecting our work to what our meaning and purpose is. We talk about burnout these days a lot, and we know that if we connect our work to a meaning and purpose, we're much less likely to experience burnout because well, we know why we're doing what we're doing and where it leads. So I would add to that meaning and purpose. And environment is very important. So if we find, and people are different when it comes to this. Some people thrive in a really busy, dynamic environment where they work in a large team and they're interacting a lot. Some people do better in a quiet environment where there aren't too many distractions, and they can focus on a task solely. We know that when we get interrupted, so with all the notifications we have these days on our phones and on our laptops, each time we get interrupted, it takes us about 15 minutes to regain our focus. So I subscribe to a quiet environment, or even doing tasks in a way where we have, say, a quiet time for about 90 minutes, and then we get up from our desk and interact with the rest of the team. But having a time assigned just to focus on task without any distractions is definitely helpful. Interruptions can definitely be difficult because we know now that our minds can't multitask. They're just switching between tasks, and having to constantly switch between tasks takes a lot of resources and a lot of energy, and it can hurt us in long term. So I'll definitely agree with both things that you've said. I also like to think about things not just when we are in the performance, but what are the things that we need to go do ongoingly, or what are the things that we need to do pre-performance to be at our optimal when we are performing. So how much sleep we get, and I know we all hear about sleep, exercise, nutrition, hydration as a must, but there is a good reason for that. So in order to perform in peak performance, we need to be focused and concentrate well. And we know that if we haven't slept enough, or if our sleeping routine is quite irregular, that can really impact our concentration and focus. Similarly, if we're not eating well and we're not nourishing our body, we're not taking the nutrients that we need, or if we're not exercising, and hydration again. I feel hydration is something that can suffer too, unless we mindfully and purposefully have a glass of water on our desk, or a bottle of water on our desk. We sometimes forget to drink. But something like 2% less than optimal. So if our hydration is 2% under the optimal level, that can really severely impact on our concentration, for example. So there would be the other things that would be important. And that we should really endeavor to do as part of our routine. So not skipping the exercise class in the morning, or sacrificing it to have more hours to do work. Knowing that having that exercise routine in the morning, although it might take an hour or so, will then help our productivity because our mind will be clearer, we'll have more energy. So really prioritizing that, I would say that will be another thing that on the list of priorities. Um, Other things that are important pre-performance, well, understanding when we are deciding on the tasks that we're going to do, well, we know that there are three elements that impact on our motivation. A lot of the times with my clients, whether it's in executive coaching or whether it's when I work as a therapist, because I double in both fields, people would
Hmm.
say, well, I really feel like I don't have motivation and I'm really struggling with procrastination. So, also ensuring that what we're doing in our daily life meets our psychological needs, our three main psychological needs. One of them is competency. So, again, that we're not feeling overly challenged by our roles to the point that we feel like, oh, there is no way I can complete all this. And that happens a lot of the times when we're setting very unrealistic expectations. And that generally makes us just want to give up because on some rational level we know like, this is impossible, this is not going to happen. I'm set, and it is really literally setting ourselves up for failure. So ensuring that what we set out to do each day is somewhat challenging but not overly challenging where we to the point where we feel that it's unrealistic. So that's that need for competency being met. Secondly, that we feel that we have a control over what we're doing. So there is some sense of perceived control and autonomy because that need for autonomy is greatly, it's something that we have a strong need for, and that is highly connected to intrinsic motivation. And then thirdly, it is important that we can relate or that we feel that we belong. So even if we are a one-man show and we are in the office most of the time on our own, still well, interacting with the rest of the, finding ways to interact with, say, well, I have my own room, but then I leave my room from time to time and I might talk to the receptionist or I might talk to the other therapists or other coaches. So that sense of belonging, meeting the social need as well. So if our jobs are meeting these three needs, we're more likely to be motivated and less likely to procrastinate. So I would say that would be an important thing as well, because a lot of the times we know what we need to do, but we're not doing it. And that is largely because we're either overwhelmed or we might feel that we're stuck. There is a role that we have to do, but we really don't want to do it. Or we don't feel that we feel alone and isolated, and that doesn't help. Um,
So we have, you mentioned a word there, pre-performance, right? So there's
mhm.
pre-performance, and we spoke about before this podcast around the three phases. Do you want to just share quickly what those three phases are in the context of this, and then I'll go through those different elements you spoke about, just so we have a guide map of where we're going. So we've got pre-performance, and then
Performance and then post performance. And really, if we
yeah,
want to maintain that state of peak performance and or optimal performance, we need to look at all three. It's hard to isolate a performance outside of preparation, and it's also important how we evaluate our performance and what we do with that evaluation in order to then either build the agency to want to engage and perform more or to give up basically. So they would be the three phases. And so in terms of that first phase, things that I've mentioned so far, I would only add to that visualization. So a lot of the times we need confidence and belief that we can accomplish something in order to engage in it or in order to do well. So if we've had no experience, so say we are a business owner that has never faced, say something like having to hire staff or network. Maybe they're an introvert and they're not great at networking. They don't consider themselves great at networking. Sometimes visualizing that going well can also help in doing better and eliminating some of that self-doubt, because how our brain perceives it is as an experience, as something that may have happened. And it also activates neural pathways that would be activated if that actually happens. So we know that visualization is a powerful tool to prepare to. So that would pretty much sum up that pre-performance phase.
Awesome. And just as a checklist for those listening, so we have understanding your values, I guess controlling your environment, or rather, creating the environment that you want. So an environment with free from distractions, ideally. Meaning and purpose. So having a meaning and purpose behind what you're doing. As you mentioned, burnout is likely to happen if you're doing something you don't feel connected to. Number 4 is self-care. So around having those rituals and routines, good sleep, good recovery, exercise, things like that. And I think number 5 was around psychological needs. So I guess that ties into the meaning and purpose, but different area. And feel free to jump in there and define that more if you wanted to. And then a balance between, I guess, challenge and control, having that flow state, which you can find in that book as well, that flow book, around having
Yes.
control of the environment, also being challenged enough, but not too much to the point where you're, this is just impossible. So that balance there as well. And then the last one was visualization. And I imagine that also is positive self-talk. So an example of that for me is around, so growing up as a kid, I had really bad social anxiety to the point where it was, it would make me blush when speaking to someone. And one of the ways that I moved through that was when I stopped drinking alcohol and I started to go out sober. And as I was out sober, I would do one or two things. I would make up situations in my mind where I was confident. Or number 2, I would remember the times every now and then where I felt really confident. So I would, visualize in my mind, or I'd say to myself, I remember that time when I was like this. I'd feel anxious, I feel social anxiety. And I remember a time in the past where I felt really calm, really free associative, really flowy, where words just flowed and that kind of effortlessness came through me. I just remember that. I wouldn't put pressure on myself to feel that way. I'd just say, oh, look, remember that time you like that? Or what would it feel like if you were that? As opposed to like, feel this way or feel that way. So there was that freedom from shame around who I should be or who I shouldn't be. So that visualization piece and that positive self-talk piece is a huge element, I believe. So we have those elements there. And feel free to expand on those more if you want to. But I guess, what is performance? We have pre-performance, and then we have performance. So what is performance in relation to pre-performance, and what is inside of performance? And is that during the time you're actually doing the thing?
So I really like the story that you shared, and thank you for sharing that. But what you were doing there, you were self-regulating basically, and you were building the evidence list
Yeah.
for positive thinking, which then led to a positive outcome. So during the performance, self-regulation is an important thing. So typically, well, we need a certain level of pressure to perform well. If there was no pressure, if there were no nerves, we hear this. Rock stars, I think Mick Jagger was talking about still being nervous before he goes on a stage. This was a few years back that I've heard him say that, and you would never guess that, right? But we do need a degree of nerves or pressure or that arousal to perform well. The problem is when that pressure becomes overwhelming. Generally, what happens in that case is our performance starts declining. So that's described by inverted U shape. It's a theory by Yerkes and Dodson, and it still stands quite well. So what we want to do is, as we go into a performance, is ensure that there is a level of arousal, but if it is becoming overwhelming, then decrease that. So we can do that either by doing breathing exercises, for example. I subscribe to breathing exercises. I know there is still a very mixed opinion on whether it works or it doesn't work. I feel it doesn't work if we wait until we are in a red zone with our emotions and then try to breathe. I think you mentioned earlier, you said, well, when you're in that survival mode, sometimes you just don't want to hear that you don't want to hear it, basically, like you're so far beyond. Oh yes, perfect, you're sharing that on the screen. So sometimes when there is too many nerves and too many emotions, we are likely to fall down the U curve and either experience burnout or have a very poor performance. So why breathing helps and why it works is that we know that when we are in survival mode or in fight, flight, or freeze, or fight and flight response, we are breathing very fast and our heart beats very fast and our mouth gets dry. So just by slowing down breathing, we are slowing down the stress response. And some of that arousal gets neutralized, basically. So then that pushes us back up that curve again. So self-regulation in that respect, so checking in, where are we at, what's happening, how is our breathing, how are we feeling, that we're not in a panic mode, I would say would be the first step. And then state of flow. So ideally, we would get into that state of flow. Some people swear by it and they say, I have heard people say that they're in state of flow most of the time when they're doing their jobs, which is incredible. Some people will say, well, I've experienced it a couple of times, but there are some key ingredients that help us get into a state of flow and then stay in a state of flow. It's an incredible state where we are task focused. So a lot of that self-focus, like, will I do well? What will the people think? What will happen? That energy, self-focused energy, is generally not helpful during the performance. What we want to focus our energy is on the actual task, on what we actually have to do. So in a state of flow, our focus and concentration is mostly on what needs to be done. Again, the task is not too challenging, not too easy. And it's also great to get feedback immediately. So we know that, which again, it's not always within our control and it's not always available, but we know that while we're in a state of flow, if we get feedback immediately, we're more likely to stay in that state of flow and get back into it again. It's an enjoyable state where we lose ourselves, where again, we're not likely to burn out. We're really likely to just enjoy what we're doing. So that's how I would describe that ideal peak performance. So engaging our prefrontal cortex, focusing on a task, and letting go of unnecessary negative thoughts, basically, or not giving them too much airtime.
And so around the piece of not entering panic mode. So when someone's doing something that's quite stressful or outside their comfort zone, I mean, if breathing is not working, if, self-talk is not working, you still feel that anxiety or you still feel that panic, which I think, people who are in the know around personal development, they know things about self-regulation. let's say, for example, it's their first time speaking in front of a group of individuals. It might be even something like doing a Zoom call with, 10, 15 people for the first time, or a high intensity meeting with important people on a call, which is, just two or three people. But they're in that panic mode. They've done the breathing. They've done the positive self talk and things like that. Is there like an SOS button that someone can push, or is there like a special hack that you can, I guess, implement, or is it just rather it is what it is and I can't control it? What's the positive side of this, and then moving from that side? Is that the only real solution, or is there something else we're not
Yeah.
seeing?
Trying to stir ourselves back to the task. So, asking ourselves the question, what am I doing here? What is the purpose of this? Is generally helpful because it is diverting our attention again from that negative self focus, which is generally hurting us during the performance and the biggest thing that hurts us. So, it's
Yeah.
saying and trying to, well, if you're having audience on a Zoom, then really thinking, well, what is this audience hoping to get, making it about them and meeting their needs rather than, well, how will I come across? What does this make me look like? Yeah, trying to stir ourselves back to task and why
Mm.
we're doing that task in the first place. Is good. I mean, obviously, as well, understanding that we probably catastrophizing, that it is much worse in our mind to what it is on the outside, and that it's not the end of the world if it doesn't work out. So sometimes that also can help lower those expectations and that pressure and shift us back up the curve too. For example, with my daughter, when she has exams, I would always say, well, no exam can possibly measure your greatness or who you are as a person. So all you can really
Mm-hmm.
do is you go out there and you do your best. And whatever the results are, that's what the results are. So not worrying too much about the outcome as much as enjoying the process and really focusing on the task, giving it our best. It's our best bet, really, to do well. Um,
Yeah, awesome. Okay, then. So, again, so for those listening, so I guess in my own words, having an exteroception or being exteroceptive rather than interoceptive, so focusing less on the internal and more on the external. And to really bring that home, it's like, where am I right now? What room am I in? What is going on outside of me? You know, and not overly focusing on someone's response to how you're doing what you're doing. It's like, how am I? So I think there's a balance, almost like there's a balance between being internal. So when you're speaking or presenting, it's just like feeling your body and feeling the kind of words come out of you. And then when you're, I guess, listening or being, this is what I do when I'm on a podcast, for example. And then when you're listening, it's focusing, like, where am I? What am I doing? What's the words coming out of the person's mouth? And I think that's a nice balance between using the internal side of things, which is when you're talking, sometimes you might think that person's perceiving me this way or the other, but just enjoying the flow of talking, enjoying the words coming out. And then externally, when you're listening to someone or when you're receiving feedback, it's just like focus on the outside. Do you think that's a good kind of map to go by as far as it
yeah,
pertains to, I guess, public speaking and conversations?
yes, I think that's really well said. Yeah, so checking in with ourselves, as you said, how are we breathing? Are we breathing really fast?
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms, because that's the one thing we can control rather than relying on what feedback are we getting? Are people liking us? Are they clapping for us? Are they? So relying on that and then thinking, well, what is the purpose and what I'm doing? How do I serve others? Using a podcast, an example, I would imagine that you would have to do that a lot. So balancing your own thoughts and your inner world with what the other person's presenting.
Absolutely. It never gets easier either. It's always not I guess harder, but it's always a balance between those two things. And I think from a performance point of view, there's never like you said, pressure. There always has to be pressure. And I've seen not always has to be pressure, but always has to be a certain amount of pressure. And I've seen people in the sport that I watch is UFC. individuals in there who get used to doing fights or used to performing in front of crowds of thousands of people, you see they eventually start to get unfazed by it. And that isn't always the best thing, because when they're like that, they kind of overestimate their confidence. And there was one guy, you might even know him, in Australia, Alexander Volkanovski. And this is just my opinion, this is just my observation. But
Hmm.
he was a champion for a long time, and he entered into a fight, like the biggest fight of his career, and he mentioned before this fight that he felt no nerves, he felt like just pretty comfortable. And how much of that is, him just saying that versus how he actually feels. But when he was walking out, from my perception, he wasn't nervous at all. Like, he seemed completely fine. He was very calm. He wasn't like, you didn't see he was tense or trying to hype himself up. He was just like kind of walking, casually. And then after the fight, or sorry, during the fight, you could see that he was playing around a lot, like being a bit too playful. And the way the scoring was is that in the scoring points from a viewer, it was like a match, like it was so close. But the other guy ended up winning, so he lost this, winning like a double belt kind of thing, the double champ status as they call it. And so he lost that fight just by like that much. And during the fight, he was just playing around and kind of doing some things that if he had more pressure on him, in my opinion, he would have performed better in those moments. So it seems to me, based on that example, that when there's not enough pressure, you almost overestimate how good you feel. So you're like, I feel so amazing right now. I'm feeling really, calm and collected. So then you might start doing things that aren't conducive to getting the result. And that pressure almost keeps you in integrity.
It's true. Yeah. If there wasn't for pressure and nerves, there wouldn't be preparation. But also, yeah, it could be under arousal. So, and that could hurt the performance, especially I would imagine in that setting. Because, yeah, so that I think how you describe it makes a complete sense. That may have as well been a case. And we've all done that, right? When we become complacent.
Yeah.
So we've done something so many times that we just think, well, maybe, I don't really have to prepare for it that much, or I don't have to do that much for it. And then we realize when we are in a performance mode that maybe it would have been better if we did put a little bit of effort in, or if we did stress out about it just a little. So,
Yeah. When someone is in that performance phase and they're feeling like they might be bored, like they're used to this process. And again, I use myself as an example, but let's say I'm doing podcasts, 3 or 4 times a week, and 2 or 3 months in, I start to get bored. I'm like, this is just getting boring. I don't feel like this is conducive to what I'm doing in my career or whatever it might be. Is there like a post performance way of going about this? In order to assess or to bring forth new challenges in the field that we might get bored with. And again, it could be for a performer, it could be someone in the sports field, it could be a business owner who's doing, large sales deals where they get their first, $100,000 deal through the door, and they find that they're doing those, once every 3 months. That'd be awesome. And then after a while, they get bored with that. So, what does that process look like to, I guess, appraise or look at how to improve? And then what is the other side where it's poor performance? Could we go through the last phase on that one?
definitely. Yeah, so appraisal is really important, and it's important to acknowledge both what went well and what
Mm-hmm.
we want to improve. I think if we're just looking for things to improve on, that can also become discouraging, right? So acknowledging both equally and trying to take that step back and be really as rational about it as possible. The things we can appraise our performance on could be things like, in example that you just mentioned, your values. So, say if one of your values is growth and ongoing growth, then noticing that perhaps you are stagnating, or that value hasn't been met, or that need for growth hasn't been met, is really a great thing, because then you can potentially think of making the podcast somehow more challenging. And that could be maybe branching off to the topics or themes that you haven't explored before, whatever that is for you, whatever that means for you. But it is important not to stay in that state, especially if we value grow, where we feel that we stagnating and where it becomes a routine and it becomes repetitive, because we know that being overworked leads to burnout, but we also know that being understimulated can also lead to burnout. Because at that point, and I think you mentioned that as well, we are losing a sight of our purpose. We're thinking, why am I doing this? This is so repetitive and so boring. I've done this so many times. And we're not seeing really how that connects to our purpose. So it's a time then for a review, and having an honest conversation with ourselves and saying, well, what would make this more challenging, or is there something else I need to be doing to be stimulated? What is going on?
And
And
so
look,
with the sorry, go for it.
yep, no, you finish.
I was going to say, so with the say for example, the under simulation, what are some, I guess, questions we might ask ourselves in the post performance process? So again, if you're feeling, I think there's either two paths you go down, and tell me if I'm wrong here. Path one is understimulated, bored, it's too easy. Is there a set of questions for that? And then B, performance went bad. I did really shocking, like this went bad, that went bad. What are the processes for A and then for B? And I guess what are some questions we can ask ourselves in the post-performance process?
Knowing whether we are understimulated or not, some good ways to figure out if we are or not is, are we slightly uncomfortable? Because we know if we are very comfortable, we're probably not growing and not stretching beyond our comfort zone. So is there that feeling of being slightly uncomfortable? Are there nerves there around it? We could ask ourselves, are we growing? Have I been learning anything new? Have I developed any new skills with this? How does this make me feel? And if you are feeling bored, or you're dreading it, or you procrastinate about it, well, that could be a good insight that it may as well be understimulating. So our emotions are really telling us, well, if we want to listen to them, but generally they are a good insight into what's going on. So it's really tuning in into, why am I feeling this way? What is this emotion telling me? Or even labeling that emotion. A great thing to do that, because I feel we live in a society where emotional intelligence is still underdeveloped in most of us. Apparently, something like 35% of people have adequate emotional intelligence, and
Wow.
people are still afraid of saying how they feel, acknowledging how they feel. A good tool to use to label our emotions is emotions wheel. I don't know if you've ever come across that, but so each one of the main emotions has so many other ways it can be described. So anger, like frustrated, irritated, not heard, or so really trying to pinpoint to where is this exactly coming from? And in this case, boredom probably would be a good insight in a case of being understimulated. There we go. So so some of them, and this one I actually use the exact one that you've brought up.
Oh, wow.
That's an excellent one. Yeah, you wouldn't think there would be that many ways to describe our emotions,
Yeah, wow.
but very useful. And
Great.
then
And no, please
when
carry
it
on.
comes to Yep, when it comes to experiencing that overwhelm, so we are starting to slide down the curve on the other end, and our performance starts to suffer because there is too much pressure. Then it is saying, well, how am I feeling? How am I breathing, as I said earlier? Um, Am I really nervous that, I feel like I'm going to forget everything? It's generally like these negative thoughts and cognition start showing up. Oh, I will forget everything. Or, the worst possible scenarios, we start catastrophizing. It generally goes beyond the task at hand or the performance at hand. So it's like, well, if I don't do well with this, then that will impact on my job and I might lose my job and nobody's going to love me because I'm not lovable. Like we just it tends to go on and on. Like we get into that state of mind where again we're not problem solving, we're not using our logic. We're generally stuck and emotional, overly emotional. So I would use that as a bit of a guideline.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so then to kind of put it all together, so we have pre-performance, we have performance, then we have post-performance. I guess just a quick recap over those areas, and just maybe some other comments on those areas if you wanted to add them. But just for those listening, a recap of those three areas, and then we can wrap up from there. So let's start with pre, and then performance, and then post.
Sure. So pre-performance, we're thinking about our values, meaning, and purpose, trying to connect the task that we're doing to that. We're also ensuring that a task is meeting our basic psychological needs, being competence, autonomy, and relatedness. We are also ensuring that, well, before we even start with any of this, that we have a good level of skills. So there is a good deal of preparation. We're ensuring that we have a good routine, that we're looking after ourselves, eating well, exercising, being hydrated, and sleeping well, which generally means going to bed at the same time, waking up at the same time, and sleeping 7 to 8 hours every night. And visualizing. So if we feel that we still lack confidence, there is a lot of self-doubt, then really visualizing this going well, the performance going well. Positive self-talk, that's something that is your input to what I've suggested, and that can definitely be helpful as well. And even writing an evidence list, which is what I really like, that you've mentioned that in these high pressure situations, you would go back to evidence that you can do well. So, I sometimes write evidence lists if I'm in a really high pressure situation, why I will do well. So that sometimes helps in arguing with our brain. The performance phase, self-regulation comes in. Really, it's an important factor here, ensuring that we are in that on that side of the curve where there isn't too much pressure, but that there is some arousal and pressure and some nerves that are enhancing our performance, and trying to get into a state of flow, which will be determined again with how comfortable or uncomfortable we feel with the task, getting the immediate feedback as well would be the other thing too. Post-performance, really having a look at what went well, what didn't go so well, how did we feel about that? If we were to engage into the same thing, so say we are a small business owner and we're reflecting or appraising our day and how it went, well, what are the things that did go well? What are the things that we could do a bit better? Are we overwhelming ourselves and giving ourselves too much to do to the point that we're hurting our performance? Are we underwhelming ourselves and are we understimulated? And I feel always positive reinforcement is an important thing. So always finding positives and acknowledging the growth, even if it is very small, even if it's a 1% growth, it still is growth. So that gives us agency, that gives us a desire to keep pushing and keep going. Somehow there's that negative bias, which is an evolutionary thing, and we tend to remember, if I ask people, well, how is everything going? How has your week been? And there may have been a great week, but then there was a one thing that didn't go their way, and they would generally remember that thing first. So it's remembering the good as well, and remembering the positive as well, and that generally works way, way better than negative reinforcement or being hard on ourselves and beating ourselves up, right? So, that would be a summary in brief.
Awesome. And for those who want a more hands-on approach and to, I guess, work with you directly, how would they go about that?
So I run a practice called Eudaimonia HQ, which means human flourishing. It comes from Aristotle, and that is the website. I work from Sydney, so I can see people face to face in Sydney, and obviously also online over the Zoom. My website is www.eudaimoniahq.au. So not .com, so .au, and my email is also on the website, and so is the phone number. I'm on LinkedIn, not on other social media platforms, but I am active on LinkedIn, and it's just my profile is my first name and 2 last names, which aren't easiest to spell or remember, but I would imagine that you'll be putting them somewhere next to the podcast. So Nica Vučković-Tejone is my name, not spelled the way it's pronounced.
Wonderful. And I'll add that again to the show notes as well, and the link to the website, and also to your LinkedIn as well. Thanks for taking the time to come on. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Getting Mental podcast. If you like this episode, then you'll love this one here and this one here. Check them out.